Welcome to Brave. Be inspired by the best leaders of Southeast Asia tech. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. I'm Jeremy Au, a VC, founder, and father. Join us for transcripts, analysis, and community at www.jeremyau.com. Hey, Mika, good to have you on the show.
Hey, really excited to be here.
I'm really excited to share your story as a product leader and as a future founder. And also from my perspective, your relationship with the Philippines as someone who grew up there, worked on Kumu, who's headed towards being, Philippines' first unicorn, hopefully, fingers crossed. But also someone who's also making a decision to currently be part of the Diaspora, right? Working and having studied in the States as well. So we'd love to, really kind of like open up the box here and chat more about it. So for you, Mika, for those who don't know you yet, how would you introduce yourself?
Yeah. Start with I'm Mika. I was born and raised in the Philippines and really came out to the US by way of college. So I studied at Wesleyan University and had a great time, although the transition moving from the Philippines over to the US was pretty difficult. I then was able to go back to the Philippines for this internship, and actually my foray into tech and my decision to work in the tech space started when I worked for this healthcare tech startup called MedGrocer. And it was there that I saw that tech, even in emerging markets like the Philippines, had the potential to impact millions with just a click of a button. So I said, okay, tech it is. And the natural next question was, okay, where do I fit in this tech world? Where was able to take some computer science classes, but didn't necessarily want to be the software engineer. I could do sales and marketing, but didn't necessarily want to be in that space. So I really started off by becoming a product designer and worked in a robotics ed tech startup as the next internship in Silicon Valley. And then increasingly heard about this product manager role from everyone I was working with. And it at the time was still, and even now, was a nebulous and ambiguous job. But the more that I learned about it, the more that I felt it fit into my personality, wanting to dip my toes in all different aspects of building a product. It touched on my desire for impact and also fit into my goals to when I start my own thing. So after college, was lucky to be part of Kleiner Perkins Fellowship Program, where I was paired as a product manager with one of their portfolio companies, Ripcord, which was a robotic digitization startup. Fancy way of saying we scanned a lot of paper and put it into our software product. And then after that, had a stint at Kumu, which at the time they were, I want to say, less than 10-person startup, really still trying to figure out what exactly Kumu was, and was, or they still credit me to helping them find product market fit within the live streaming space and focus there. So really built a relationship with the founders and really excited for their trajectory. The team moved over to the Philippines, and I decided I wanted to stay in the US for a longer time. And then was able to find a job at LinkedIn as a product manager in the small business hiring team. So I was at LinkedIn for 2 years, and great learning experience, but knew that my heart still lay in the startup world and knew that I wanted to start my own thing. So decided to do that in the better half of this year. Quit my job at LinkedIn and found another fellowship program. I'm a fellowship power user here. Found another fellowship program that gave us funding and advisors and a really awesome community of other folks to validate ideas with, and also found my co-founder who I was friends with from Kleiner Perkins. And here I am exploring the creator economy space and building tools for creators.
Amazing. So, let's go back in time, right? So what was it like growing up in the Philippines?
Yeah. Oh, I honestly had a great experience growing up in the Philippines. So double clicking into that, I first studied in this private all girls school for elementary school, and then went to this very rigorous science high school for 4 years. And interestingly, figured out that although I had a great time, it was a very challenging school, lots of homework, lots of late nights. After 4 years of immersing myself in the sciences, decided like, I don't really want to be a scientist, and more wanted to pursue ideas to apply the sciences, technology, and merge that with the business world and actually make it practical. So that was my educational journey, but loved growing up in the Philippines. And this is also like the difference that I saw was that is a very collectivist society, very familial. So I grew up with 25 cousins, 25 first cousins, and we always had Sunday dinners, and that was always such a great time. And I'm still really close to my first cousins, and we're all in different parts of the world, but still come together every so often. And that colored a lot of my childhood, being around family, being surrounded by family, and also colors a lot of, where in the future I want to be going back to Southeast Asia, going back to the Philippines, because that's where home is. That's where my family is. So yeah, colored by family a lot.
Wow, that's amazing. I must have been a ton of fun having Sunday dinner with
Yep.
25 first cousins.
Super fun.
Yeah, I can imagine. Um, so, I think the interesting part, obviously, for everybody that's thinking about this is, what is the Philippines, right? So because it's an interesting space, right, where I think for a ton of Americans, it's an emerging market. So that's how they think
Yep.
about it. They think about it as a place where there's a lot of great tech diaspora coming there. Everyone's fluent in English, so they're looking very much as a, either a source of inputs or a place for outputs, right? In that
Yep.
sense. And then for a lot of Southeast Asians, it's a place where it's very Americanized as a place out of all the Southeast Asian countries, right? And for everybody else, it's just kind of like, yeah, what's going on, right? So, what's your point of view of like what is the Philippines? Yeah.
Tough question. If we're thinking about the Philippines from a tech perspective, I think a lot of interest has been drawn for investors or founders because, one, it's, as you mentioned, almost everyone, probably everyone can speak English. So very, very relatable in that sense. A market that is rife for without language barriers. Second is also very, very, very social media savvy. I think there's a huge stat about how many users there are in the Philippines, in particular for Facebook or Instagram or all these social media platforms, and how many people are using it daily. So lots of usage coming from the Philippines, and also possibly partly why Kumu is seeing such success, because it effectively is the social media app for the Philippine diaspora. So I think those might be the two major things. And then also, if we were to put in a third one related to that first, like English language, a lot of call centers or BPOs or customer support teams are coming from the Philippines because they speak such good English, have very hospitable personalities coming from familial roots, and relatively cheap labor, right? So I think that's how it's colored within the tech sphere. That said, I think there's also the flip side of it, where it's still a pretty nascent market in terms of building tech or tech infrastructure, inclusive of capital, inclusive of really, really smart people. But then once you try to find engineering managers, for example, there's not a lot of training for managerial support or executives. Yeah, so it's around the talent is smart, but then needs more training, right? I think it's growing, but definitely needs a lot more support, and attempting to do some of that through community labs, for example, where we have Philippine startups and other Southeast Asian startups and pairing them with resources in the US so that they can get the mentorship or the advice or kind of just the conversations going to help spur their ideas in those markets.
So those are all true, right? Which is that I think the Philippines is a huge contributor of technology to the world, right? I mean, like you said, in the past through the call centers and a lot of the, I think the first wave of, outsourcing
Yep.
remotely, especially in the technology world, for like, call centers, moderations, things like that. And also, I think from a diaspora perspective has also been huge, right? In terms
Right,
of like
right.
them contributing to lots of technology all across, the
Philippines. Yep.
states actually because of that. I think language fluency and also because of that cultural similarity. Actually, I think the Filipino diaspora finds it pretty easy, right, to
Mm.
be contributing right actively in the states. So, I'm just kind of curious from your perspective a little bit here, which is what was it like for you, moving to the States, right? Because you are part of that wave, right, of
Mm.
people who have left the Philippines, for a time or permanently to the States. So what was that like? What was driving that decision for you to, educate, was it your family? Was it you? Tell us more about that.
Yeah, great question. It's definitely a mix of feeling that I needed to take this opportunity. And then some of it was also me wanting to explore. So maybe the story behind that is when I was applying to colleges, I applied to a couple in the US, kind of ill informed. I was just like spraying and praying wherever I could go, but also applied to schools in the Philippines. And I actually got into some schools in the US, but absolutely could not afford it without a scholarship, and so definitely needed a scholarship to get in, and was waiting on that. Simultaneously, the school calendar at the time, at least for the Philippines, was earlier, and I'd already enrolled in a particular school in the Philippines and was super excited and really wanted to pursue that path because it was already ingrained in my head that it was going to be a fun kind of experience for me. Then I clearly remember one day in the summer, I wake up and I have this letter from Wesleyan. And at that point, I was like, yeah, Wesleyan already kind of put me in a wait list for the scholarship program called Freeman Asian Scholarship. And I was like, wait list. What are the chances? Got this letter, and turns out I got off the wait list and was the candidate for the Freeman Asian Scholarship for the Philippines. So that was full ride on tuition to go to the US. So absolutely affordable at this point. And my reaction was that I cried, not even tears of joy. I cried because I was really sad to be leaving home, and I was already super excited to go to this other school, and I had to kind of turn that down to go to some foreign land, some foreign school that I did not research about. And kind of, I felt compelled to take that opportunity. At that moment, I knew that I was going to be choosing Wesleyan, whether I liked it or not. So that was the story there. It ended up being one of the best decisions of my life. Love Wesleyan, and 4 years there was amazing and opened up opportunities for me to beyond college. But the first year was really hard. It was such a big contrast from the Philippines, right? So I was adjusting to a completely new culture. I was adjusting from like high school to college. I was adjusting to a completely new school, and like by the way, Wesleyan is very liberal compared to the Philippines, which is still pretty conservative, not politically, but like in terms of thought, right? So it was a lot to adjust to. And I'd say I was fully adjusted only after a year studying at Wesleyan. One of the biggest things that was difficult as well was, I think I alluded to, the Philippines and Asia being a very collectivist society. I was around family a lot. I grew up having those more collectivist culture and ideals, and in the U.S. individualistic society, chasing the American dream, and all that jazz. So it was a big contrast. and it manifested in small ways, manifested in really deep and big ways as well. And that was something to get over. And I think what helped me was my communities. Speaking of collectivism, so joined a very into dance, so hip hop dance troops. There's a Philippine group as well, so was very invested in that and was around other Filipinos, which was really nice. And a bunch of other communities, so helped start like the tech entrepreneurship community, et cetera. So gravitated towards all these communities that helped me adjust to a different life at Wesleyan, made it much more worth it.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I can imagine that full ride scholarship really being an inflection point for you, right? Because I
Mm,
think you deciding to stay in the Philippines because you had no other option in that sense,
mm.
versus now having the option, but also have that be, full ride scholarship basically meant that,
Yeah.
your life could have, been very different, right? And so that makes total sense. I mean, I think, I too did the same thing, right? I had the
Mm,
opportunity to do an undergrad degree in the States at UC Berkeley, and I took the
mhm.
opportunity to go for it. And I think my life would have been very different if I had
Yep.
stayed at a local university. Maybe not for the worse, and maybe not for the better, but it's,
Mhm.
all I know is that it was probably very different, right? In
Yep.
terms of the attitudes, the colors, the communities I built along the way. There you are for your 4 years, and then you decide you're hitting graduation and you make a
Mhm.
decision, right? Where you and
Mhm.
I differ a little bit, right? Because you make a decision to stay in the States.
Mhm.
And for me, I made a decision to go back to Singapore.
Mhm.
Obviously, very different context, very different, directions, different countries. But what was your mind? Because I think there's a common problem for a lot of folks, right? Which is there's a ton of Filipino students out there who are thinking to themselves, should I go back to the Philippines after graduating, or should I stay in the States? So, what was your thought process then? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, super great question. Asking all the hard stuff. I think for me, the decision of going back to the Philippines or Southeast Asia in general was always a question of not not if but when. And so, even today, I still have those aspirations of going back home effectively, but all a matter of figuring out when that's going to be. But going back in time, when I was in college in my 4 years there, if you ask any of my classmates, they're like, "Yeah, Mika loves the Philippines. She's going to go back right after we graduate." So at that moment, when I was deciding, like, should I be staying in the U.S. and even like specifically go to Silicon Valley, get into the whole world of tech versus go back home, it was a pretty tough decision still, and like had a lot of reflection. Um, and decided that at the time decided I would write out my OPT, which in at the time I thought it was just going to be 1 year. So I was like, yeah, like I'll take this 1 year opportunity to immerse myself in all things tech in Silicon Valley. I'll be even better within the tech field when I do go back after that 1 year. So let me take this opportunity because it's really hard to visa shit or visa things are very hard. So decided to ride that OPT wave. And then interestingly, after that year, I then had to make another decision because apparently my major changed such that I was eligible for the STEM OPT. So I was like, okay, well, what do I do? Same decision making process was like, I'm going to write it out again just for 2 more years and then go back home. I will be even better prepared for it. Um, and then you probably kind of understand. I've been in the U.S. now for 7 years, close to 8. So kind of just kept that habit of like after this, after that, etc. So again, always a matter of when, not if, and still really deciding for myself when that might be. And I have no great answer for it, honestly. I think always the decision is like, hey, love my family, always still constantly visit, still love the Philippines, still believe that, I can help grow the tech wave through my experiences being in Silicon Valley and kind of give back to the Philippines and pour my experiences there. But also, the Philippines, in terms of tech, is still catching up and is sometimes said to be 10 years behind, though, like, there are the likes of Kumu or these other startups that are kind of propagating, which is very, very exciting for that world. But yeah, ultimately, like, tech in Silicon Valley is still tech in Silicon Valley, and kind of sometimes hard to figure out when to move out of that into a different type of opportunity to make an impact.
Yeah, wow. I think where I really agree with you is that I had some similar trade-offs on my side, right? Because,
Mm,
when I was at UC Berkeley, I was graduating, and my calculus was similar because I knew that it was a matter of when I would go back to Singapore at some point because family's there.
yeah.
And where the trade-off was a little bit different was because at that time, technology was not really seen as a space for business folks. I was at UC Berkeley and
Mm,
Google was just starting to hire business folks to run account management for them. So it was just,
mm,
it was starting to percolate in everybody's heads. But at that point of time, I had internet, startups in, Berlin and Beijing.
mm,
But still, I was, the job that I ended up taking was in management consulting at Bain, right? And
right.
basically, taking a job in Bain in Southeast Asia would be the equivalent of taking a job at Bain in the States, right? And I
Mm,
remember the partner was pitching me and say, "Hey, Jeremy, you should come back to Southeast Asia because, this is 2012. So do you really want to be working on cost cutting projects in the States, or do you want to grow,
mm,
be in a region where shampoo is growing like by
quickly.
itself, right? As like
Yeah.
crazy. And so there's so much, like all the projects in Southeast Asia are going to be about growth, whereas all the projects in America are going to be like, right sizing,
Mm,
etc. And I thought that was a very compelling argument back then. Um,
mm,
but I think what I'm trying to say here is less about myself and less about your journey, but it was interesting where I think from a management consulting level, it was flat, or maybe
mm,
even more attractive to be working in Southeast Asia at that time on the frontier market.
mm,
Versus, I think what's true today about technology is that technology, I think America is really seen, and the Bay Area, not the whole United States. I would say
mhm,
the
mhm,
Silicon Valley is seen as 10x better
mm,
than all of the technology hubs across the world, right? London,
mm,
Singapore, um, even New York to some extent, right? I think Silicon
mm,
Valley and the Bay Area is still considered like, and so I think there's a very clear, what's the word, gradient, right, of excellence that, that you were thinking of.
mm.
And so, obviously you're writing the OPT, which is what every, every foreign student is doing in the States. And what's interesting is how did you get into Kumu and
Oh
what
yeah.
happened there? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So Kumu happened after my first job at Ripcord. So actually, Kumu, one of the founders is Rexy Dorado, who I had worked with in the past. He had started this thing called Kayako, which was kind of a fellowship program. Again, I'm a fellowship power user, but a fellowship program for mostly Filipino Americans or Filipinos based in the US, in my case, to go back to the Philippines for a summer and intern for a nonprofit there. So that was actually my first internship after freshman year. I had worked with Rexy's organization, and we also had like sessions every week with each other. So built a relationship with him there, stayed friends throughout, visited him in Brown when he was still a student. And then I saw they had just announced something kind of vague, right? Like Rexy posted about it. It was a very colorful like picture as part of it, and it was something to do with tech in the Philippines. And I was like very intrigued. So I read a little bit more about, I think they had a deck or some one pager. And again, still very vague, still trying to figure it out, but wanted to send feelers out there. And then I reached out and was like, hey, I have no idea what you're building, but I think it's something I'm interested in and I'm here to learn. But also want to contribute to this movement. Really, just a vision to, I think at the time was like, we're going to build a super app for the Philippines. was like, that's awesome. I wanna join it. And then had an interview, and then was in. So at the time we were, again, maybe like, I want to say 8. I was one of the first product folks joining. We had an engineering team in China. It was remote before the world was remote. And then Rexy was in DC, Roland was in LA. Like, we're all over the place. And then we had a couple people in the Philippines too, all over the place doing things remote, and figuring out what to do. And it was a really, really fun time because we were such a small team. We communicated every day because at the time we started with messaging. It was a messaging app, so we just called each other on Kumu and had strategy calls, figured out what the engineering team in China was going to be building, launch features every single day, which is really fun. So really, really fast. And yeah, kind of through that connection, was able to be in the early team at Kumu.
What was it like being employee number 8 at Kumu?
Yeah. Okay. Blanket statement, like, super fun. I think that such an early stage with such energetic founders. If you meet Roland, for example, he's like the hype man and just really good at bringing people together, really good at like encouraging the people around him. Rexy is so intellectual, maybe a bit more like a bit quieter than Roland, but still like very, very thoughtful of a human being. And then a lot of other people in that team were just such fun humans to work with. So overall, a really fun time. Overall, even if we were trying to figure things out and had many existential crises of like what Kumu exactly was going to be, it never felt stressful. It never felt like something that kept us up at night, because there was this whole like energy and trust that something was going to be panning out, so long as we kept iterating and listening to our users and trying to pull different pieces of data and hired interesting and fun people and great people to work with. So yeah, overall, really, really exciting and fun time.
So, on your background, you've shared about some of the experiments that you ran, right? So you ran QuizmoCo, you talk,
Wow,
the
throwback.
Kumu Beta launch, the explore page, some of the, the product market fit pivot. So let's start out first with like, what was it like building out QuizmoCo? That was the interesting HQ trivia approach, right? So what was that like?
Yeah. Wow. Okay. I have to like jog my memory for all of these too. It's been a while, but yeah, QuizmoCo was interesting because it was basically a growth hack, where we decided to go down this route of live streaming. Right. So this is where we kind of had some inkling of product market fit as we were focusing on the live streaming space. And QuizmoCo was inspired by HQ Trivia, which at that time was super popping. We knew that it was probably going to go away and die. And similarly, QuizmoCo was like more of a temporary thing to ride that trend so that we could get more users onto the platform. And similar to HQ Trivia is that it was rife with a lot of technical difficulties. So especially with folks in the Philippines, right? Like, worst internet ever, or not as great. So we also had to like work with our live streaming partner, which is Agora, live streaming partner, to make sure that the infrastructure for all of that was set and good, and worked with the PH bandwidth, although with like lots of ups and downs. But yeah, ultimately it achieved the goal. And this is also like, I was tapering off of Kumu. But I remember it did achieve the goal of like getting the hype and the growth and the kind of word of mouth from other Filipinos who are like, well, I can't participate in HQ Trivia, but because it's in the US, but I can participate in this Philippine version. So let me download this app and try it out and see where it goes. So yeah, that's the particular story for QuizmoCo.
Awesome. And, you shared in the past about how you increased daily active users by almost 200%. So really amazing work there. And then, I think what was interesting is that, during that time there were two shifts, right? One was the product market fit shift. And
Mm,
then the second was the geographic shift, right? In terms of the teaming. So let's talk a little bit more
mm,
about the product market fit switch. Tell us more
yeah,
about that user testing and surveys, and
yeah.
what was the problem that was causing the problem, the desire to switch or explore, experiment product market fit, and then how did you actually do it? Yeah.
So I mentioned that the pitch for Kumu was we're going to be the super app of the Philippines. And the hypothesis then was, well, also perhaps apps have messaging components. So let's start by building and focusing on the messaging part. Like a lot of focus in messaging. We had some like live streams that were part of this other page. And then we had like basically other like we had a feed that showed different live streams and an Instagram like feed, so to say. So there's a lot of things going on for it because super app, right? But also a lot of emphasis on the messaging part. So we had a lot of experiments iterating on that part, making it like the best messaging app ever, so that Filipinos kind of latched onto that and then eventually like use the other features, which was not the right way to think about it because that we don't need another messaging app. Everyone is already in this. In the Philippines, Viber is a very big one. Interestingly, they don't need. They're not going to be solving any problems with just messaging. Um, and so we were racking our brains about thinking about, okay, well, if it's not messaging, what should it be? And interestingly, at that time before I joined, it was also a bit like fluff and not fluff, but visionary, right? Like they're very visionary founders and very strategic founders, but less in the ground, like talking to users, which is where the product hat comes in, where I had a very big believer in user research and was a product designer in my past life. So I was like, yo, we need to talk to users, like set up all these user interviews with people who were already pretty power users of Kumu. Like they also didn't really know what it was, but latched onto the vision. So we talked to them and also had like put in more data events within the app, very simple ones to just see how people were using it. And through the combination of data, but really through a lot of the user research, we found out that so many people love the live streaming thing. And the messaging app was like complementing live streams. You can talk about a live stream, you can talk about the video through the messaging portion of it, but the live stream was like, wow, like I can talk to people in one go. And they're all other Filipinos around the world too. That's amazing. And a lot of people also saw the future of like, well, could I sell stuff? And so we kind of investigated more of those use cases and different ways that people were using the app and doubled down on that. So I'd say that was like the impetus was super app, but messaging is not working. Where do we go? And then the live streaming kind of took off because we are in the roots of like actually talking to users and figured it out through that.
So what was the signal there, right? Because you do these user tests and you're saying like you make that jump to say like, oh, live streaming is the future, but what was that in, you zoom in one level in, like how did you get from 100 user tests and surveys to saying live stream and supply side is what we need to focus on? How did the team reach that conclusion?
Wow, I also really have to jog my memory, but I'd say it's actually honestly through those conversations where like lots of user tests, but the immediate theme was always this live streaming app. And granted, like at that time, it wasn't. We didn't know like what part of the live stream we wanted to continue investing on. We just knew that live stream was the way to go and to like build features that helped make that experience better instead of the messaging part. So really,
Uh,
like honestly, through the user research, as we focused our resources towards building for the live stream use case, then we saw more people going through that. And again, like the Quizmoco thing was really helpful as a growth hack because then people were actually using the live streaming feature and watching. And so we're able to come into Kumu to then see themselves as the live streamers. So maybe context at the time too was we only allowed a few people to broadcast or be able to do a live stream. So while you could watch, not everyone could live stream. They had to ask us if they wanted to do it. So simultaneously with that Quizmo call launch, we also expanded it such that everybody could start a live stream. And that's also probably how it kind of boomed.
Wow, super interesting here. So what you're basically saying is while you're building a super app, you're actually able basically testing multiple products on market. One was
Yeah,
messaging, one
way
was
too much.
trivia, one was live streaming. And basically what you're saying is customer feedback was like, oh, I enjoy consuming the live stream. And other folks were like, oh, I would love the live stream. So that was just the user feedback. You just ended up slowly converging on that, right? And then eventually decided to make that strategic shift.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's a good point too, is like it was such a Frankensteinian product that we didn't, it's such an existential crisis if we were working simultaneously in all these different features. And so one big pivot was like the focus, and the focus was really, really important.
Yeah, I think the focus is really what's key, right? Because I think a lot of people are trying to like get product market fit, and then you see a signal somewhere, but you're like, oh, that not wasn't our original plan, and then there's this weird moment where half of you, not just half the team, but half of you, each person is like, let's keep going with our plan, and then the other half is like, whoa, what is the market telling us is really
Yeah.
interesting, right? Okay, so there's the live streaming side, and then you know at some point the teams basically says, let's all go back to Southeast Asia, right?
Mm-hmm.
So and that was a big decision point for everybody, right? So tell us more about that.
So majority of Kumu's market is not surprisingly in the Philippines. And of course, naturally, the team wanted to be in the Philippines, be amongst their users, create those relationships, partnerships, marketing, etc., on the ground, which made total sense. And I had to make a decision for myself of whether I wanted to join the Kumu team, which at that time was at the end of my first year of OPT. So I made the decision even tougher because then I also had like a really, really awesome team and company to join if I did go back, but also was still compelled by whatever opportunity or whatever waves I could ride with 2 more years of OPT staying in the US. Um, Ultimately, yeah, they all decided to go back. So founders found places in the Philippines, and they started hiring people on the ground. And I decided to stay again for the same reasons of so much opportunity and want to still learn a couple things that I don't think I learned enough of while in Silicon Valley, while I have this opportunity to ride the 2 years, which clearly has extended, and wanted to still try my hand at that. So yeah, tough decision, but I'm glad that I'm still really good friends with the founding team, and yeah, I have a WhatsApp chat, a group chat with them whenever there are funding announcements or new hires. I'm like, congratulations, awesome, and still supporting from afar.
Yeah, I mean, it's awesome to see you continue being supportive as advisors to the product team. Do you regret, just like not going back with them? Because, I mean, obviously you made the best decision at that time, right? Which was at that time, there's no Filipino unicorn or,
Mhm.
fast growing company that
Close to
could
it.
become
Yep.
one. And obviously Kumo was a very young team. I think it probably, how many people were there by the time when they moved back? It was like 20.
Wow, it seemed tough. So I think still less than 20, but they were
Yeah.
definitely like hiring a couple teams here
Starting
and there.
higher, right? Yeah. So like maybe like you double in size from like you employ 8 and then it was now like 16, 15 or 16 employees. So obviously, you couldn't have known that Kumu will continue growing like the way it did. And you also couldn't have known that, it would be viable and so forth. Do you ever regret, like not hit it home on this, ship that turned out to be a rocket ship?
Again, asking all the hard questions. No, I think even at the time, I believe even without the proof points of where they're at right now, I firmly believed in the team and like had good faith that they were going to be in a rising trajectory. So I was acknowledging that I was going to leave that like really huge opportunity behind if I decided not to go back. And I do like throughout have asked myself the question because they keep asking me to come back, which is I love them. That's great. And I'll always have that like existential crisis for myself. But ultimately, like I know personally that I grew a lot in the past 2 years. Being at LinkedIn, for example, I found a super great opportunity to start my own company, which is ultimately the dream and the goal to then, even if whatever I create fails and Kumu rises, which is awesome, I would love that for them. One, I'm invested in them, so I'm gonna ride that wave in some way. But also two, like I'm in it for the learning experience, and I know that again, if for example, and knocking on wood, my whatever ideas I'm pursuing don't pan out, and that's what I asked for and that's what I wanted. So I'm kind of in the space where I need to be and want to be, and that gives me comfort.
Yeah, I asked that question because it's a common problem, right? Because
Yeah.
every early employee is making a decision to be like, is this the rocket ship or is this not a rocket ship? That's one, right?
Yep.
And then the second overlay that you had, which is a very common Filipino diaspora question, which is, do I stay in the US or
Mhm.
do I go back to the Philippines, right? So that's a very interesting confluence of those
Yep.
two decisions. And that being said, I think it's totally fair because I think you've approached the decision and you've made good use of the time, apart from them. And you're still, of course, involved in them both, as
Yeah.
an investor and advisor. So it's not as if you're missing out entirely. So maybe to some extent you're getting, you know, the best of one world and a bit of the other world, right?
Yeah. I like to think
So
of it that way. Yep.
that's what you think to yourself, and then you're dreaming that like, oh, I could be part of like a over 150 people company now. It's like
Yep.
anyway, oh, you know. So that's the crux of the problem, right? For so many people across the world, I met so many Filipinos in Singapore, in
Mm,
Indonesia, in the States, who are all like building up amazing technology careers in big tech or as early employees or as even founders actually, and so I think there's something magical about the way I guess the Philippines is building technology talent, right? In terms of the education, language, cultural affinity, everything we talked about earlier. At the same point in time, like at least from my sense, I feel like I get feedback from them that they're not bullish, right, on the Philippines
mm,
or building out the
mm.
Philippines. And so very, very much conversation I have is very much like, oh, I want to build out of New York. I want to build out of the Bay Area. I want to build out of Singapore. So I'm just kind of curious about what you feel, what's going on here. Um,
Yeah. And clarifying by build out of, is it like being based or audience being in the Philippines?
I mean, it's both, right? I mean, I think you look at the Indonesians, I think it's like another similar dynamic, right? And the Vietnamese, right? Where they're building out lots of great talents, obviously not as much as what the market would love to have. And so many of them are excited to return to Indonesia, right?
Yeah.
And I've seen so many Indonesian friends who, were studying and working alongside me in the States, and they're all excited to return to Indonesia or thinking
Yeah.
hard about it. And I
Yep.
think the Vietnamese have even a little bit earlier than that have already been, going back to Vietnam to start building as well.
Yep.
But that doesn't seem to happen for the Philippines, right? So I'm just kind of curious what you think about that.
Yeah. I do think like some movement is shifting in that way. With Komu being an example, another being Paymongo. I think partly one, it is, and this is an interesting kind of perspective that I got, is like sometimes it's hard to take a risk on a market that hasn't yet seen a $1 billion company, which is a whole like interesting chicken and egg situation. And similar to like finding a market, even not geographically, when exploring different ideas and figuring out what market has the rifest, best opportunity, you want to kind of put yourself in the shoes of um, put yourself amongst other billion-dollar companies, because then if you are around $100 billion companies and in the right market for that, then maybe you'll at least land in a $1 billion company, which, for what it's worth, the Philippines has not found that yet, though fingers crossed that it does become Kumu. So I think it is an interesting like chicken and egg risky situation in that way. Is one. I think another is also certain ideas are probably better than others when it comes to these really early tech spaces, in terms of like starting a company for that audience. So I think Kumu found a good niche because social media, I mentioned like a lot of Filipinos are social media savvy and English speakers. So that penetrating that market, specifically social media in the Philippines, is a very lucrative one. And a lot of stars aligned for them too. Literally, like stars from this big media conglomerate, which got shut down by the government, flocked to Kumu. So that was a really kind of good why now and opportunistic time for them. Another interesting space is fintech in the Philippines, specifically for small businesses, where PayMongo is playing at, and I'm sure many more other companies that need to find these specific niches and markets within an already like pretty specific market in the Philippines. Some ideas are just going to be better than others. So that's second. I think last thing, more like being based in the Philippines and raising capital from there or starting a company based there. It does take extra effort in that, again, internet is not the best, but also the government is sometimes not that friendly or still needs a lot of education or a lot of openness to even trust startups based in the Philippines. Like Uber was once there and now is gone. For that reason, hiring can also be better, and the talent can also be better within that realm. So I think it's getting there, it's developing, but will take time, and hopefully very soon.
Yeah, those are all great points. I mean, it's a frank acknowledgement that, I think the Philippines, as a, for example, entrepreneurial ecosystem, like I said, is one order of magnitude lower than that of, say, Singapore or
Yeah.
Boston or New York. And
Yep.
then, and those are also one order of magnitude lower than Silicon Valley, right? In terms of entrepreneurial support, fundraising, for example. And then, of course, I
Yeah.
think the corollary to that as well is just like, we have not yet seen the exit, and then the exit doesn't generate the flywheel, right, of,
Yeah.
entrepreneurial ecosystem. So like you said, chicken and egg there. And then so nobody wants to come back. And so then again, the entrepreneurial ecosystem doesn't kickstart. So, it
Yeah.
takes actually a lot of intentional systems work by, not just individuals, but also, companies, philanthropists, and government, I think, to really get that flywheel going. Um, and so, there you are, and you're processing a lot of thoughts, right? And I think I met quite a few folks who reached out to me and they're asking me about Southeast Asia because they see this podcast and they're like, okay, here's someone who's
Nice.
like a, a thought leader and someone who's like a good span on across Southeast Asia. And I think the question they keep asking me is like, they hear all these challenges that you just talked about, right? But they also
Mm,
see the opportunity, right? What we talked about
right.
earlier, right? The language, the pool, the technology, literacy, so on and so forth. And they keep asking this question, which is like, when is the right time, right? Like, if I join now, is it too early? If I come back next year, is it going to be too late? So it's, I think there's a very much like a timing question, right? It's like, when is the right time for me to come back? Now, how would you think about it? I'm just kind of curious.
Oh, great question. This is probably not super helpful, but for sure within the next 10 years, which in VC horizons, right, is like 10 years is a pretty short time, but like maybe at an individual level, pretty long time. And yeah, maybe even if I were to like squeeze that timeline even more, even in the next 5 years, like building a network in Southeast Asia, even right now, which is beautiful because you're doing that with this podcast. I think it is important to start investing in figuring out how to find those routes in Southeast Asia because I do expect that the tech scene in particular is going to be moving. We're already seeing hints of that with people flocking back um, in different waves for different reasons. Um, and I think I forgot the specific stat, but are you familiar with iterative?
Yeah,
Yeah,
iterative and Sukan Ui was a former guest. So shout out to check out
nice.
jeremyhow.com to
Yeah,
find this episode and talk about how
there
he
you
founded
go.
iterative and his Silicon Valley experience. And like similar to you and me, how he made a decision to come back to Southeast Asia. So anyway, keep
Yeah.
going. Yeah.
I think what they're doing is awesome. And like already, again, starting their roots and investing in Southeast Asia specific markets and startups, which is really smart because by the 10 years, then they would have built that expertise. But also, I think they had this specific article or stat about why they're investing in the Southeast Asian market and why like about now as a VC is the best time to be doing it because something along the lines of the growth rate of the number of people who are on the internet is growing much more rapidly and reminiscent of like early days of the internet, which I found really, really interesting and like telling of the just trajectory of where tech and startups are going to be in the next few years. So I do think within the next 10 years, starting to do some of the work now to invest in communities, to invest in even startups in the market to start thinking about like what could be rife for Southeast Asia, like it's going to be an opportune time now even.
Yeah. So you heard it here first, Mika is within the next 5 to 10 years, there's, come home, yeah, it's tough to tell, right?
Taking a
So,
bet.
taking a bet, I think the crux for me, the way I think about it is, it's always that tough decision. It's like, do you want to be a small fish in a big pond or do you want to be a big fish
Mhm.
in a small pond, right?
Yeah.
And I think Malcolm Gladwell had a nice, uh, dynamic, and he talks about some of the asymmetry of it in his writings, right? But I think what I appreciate him saying was like, sometimes excellence comes because you take turns in each pool, right? Sometimes you're a
Mm,
small fish in a big pond to learn as much as you can, and
mm,
understand what excellence is, and get smart and build a lot, and learn from the best, and so forth. And then you come home and you become a big fish in a small pond because
right.
now you can build ownership, be intentional, be super deliberate about what you're building, and
Mm,
being able to make that splash, and of course help grow that pool, right?
mm,
And also, I think another thing he said was like, people flourish in different environments, right? So some people flourish by being a big fish in a small pond. Some people
mm.
flourish by preferring to be a small fish in a big pond. So I thought that was something that, at least when we were talking, kind of like, was in the back of my head. So
Yeah.
Mika, coming up in the quick time here. So, last question here is, you shared, obviously about some and started hinting at some of the tough times that you had, decisions you had to make. Could you share with us a time when, you were facing adversity or a challenge and you had to choose to be brave?
I'll maybe hint at two things. One that I already alluded to earlier on, which was it was such a big and difficult transition to make the decision to move from the Philippines, which I spent 18 or so years of my life in and had firm and strong roots in and really, really loved. and uproot myself, leave family at 18 years old, and move to the US in a completely foreign land and culture, and adjust to many different things. So I'd say that was like one tough and brave and um, uh, decision with absolutely no regrets. Another is probably the most recent decision of quitting my job at LinkedIn and starting this company. And was super happy to have been able to do it with the comforts of SPC, which even without SPC and like that funding, I would have done it anyway. But lucky to still have the advisorship and the funding. Was lucky to also have found my co-founder and um, meet my she's a friend from 4 years back, but we were the same stage in life and figured out that we were compatible as founders. So lucky to have had that after or before quitting my job. But it was still pretty like I'd say it was a many months, many even years in the making to gain the confidence for myself or even like decide if it was something that I really, really, really wanted to do. Um, but decided to make that jump and um, have been having a lot of fun with it actually. Again, like my heart lies in the startup world and having a lot of autonomy, at least for now, and doing a lot of these fun experiments and trying things out. Still rife with a lot of risk and challenges along the way, but enjoying it and made the brave decision to quit a very comfortable life to pursue what's long been a dream for me.
I'm so excited for you. I'm sure that no matter what happens in the next phase, it's obviously going to be good and bad, highs and lows, but I'm pretty sure you're going to be pretty awesome. And I can't wait for you to come back to Southeast Asia eventually as well. So I'll say that, and, host you for dinner sometime, right?
Ooh, that'd be fun.
That'll be fun, right? So, Mika, I think I want to kind of summarize at least the three big themes that I kind of heard from you. And I really want to thank you so much for sharing. I think the first part, I really thank you so much for sharing. It's just like sharing, what is the Philippines and, who are the people and what are the dynamics of the technology and the market and the diaspora. And I think that's such a key thing because, so many people still don't know what the Philippines are, right? The Americans don't
Mm,
fully understand. The Southeast Asians don't fully understand. And I think a lot of the diaspora are also still wondering, I'm wondering, and remembering, right? Like,
mm,
what the Philippines is. And I think it's refreshing to hear your take on it. It's not the only take, obviously,
mhm,
but is your take as a technology, as a product leader, and as a founder to have that point of view. So I think that's really interesting. Um, the second thing that I think is really interesting in terms of theme is that you have that set of experiences, obviously as Kumu's employee number 8, as a product leader, and seeing not just obviously some of the early growth hacks from building a HQ trivia clone, which is a fun story, and how you improve your daily active users to hopefully get them hooked to something else. But also how your super app approach eventually led to that pivot towards live streaming, not just through the power and importance of user research, but also because of the need to focus the whole team, right? And I think that's such a interesting story that I'm sure we're going to have more product stories in the future to debate and discuss. And I think it's such a critical moment because I think so many founding stories are like, oh, we figured it out from day one because the journalists
yeah.
have no time to write about the founding story, right? And so, it just sounds like, everybody still thinks Kumo just launched with the live streaming app, because it is what it's done today. But I think that high resolution at the early stage is so key because I think most founders kind of walk in thinking they're going to walk in with the perfect idea, but it turns out you got to
Mm,
pivot and listen to the customers. And I think that's a good reminder from your perspective. And the third theme that was really interesting was really for the Filipino, and actually not just the Filipino but also the Southeast Asian diaspora, right? They're listening in from or reading from the
mm,
US or from Europe or the UK or whatever, and they're thinking about when's the right time
mm.
and how to come home, right? And obviously, I don't think you gave any specific answers to be like because you haven't done that track yet. But I think you do provide not only the affinity, but also some of the thought processes about that. And in doing so, you're also lighting the road ahead for other folks who are in Southeast Asia who are thinking, okay, if I leave to do my undergrad or my, master's or get work experience outside Southeast Asia, what's my path back, right? And I think your honest take on it is helpful to both the current diaspora, but also future diaspora in the making. So those are my three summary of what I took away from my notes here from you, Mika. And thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for summarizing and thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share this episode with friends and colleagues. Sign up at www.jeremyau.com to discuss this episode with other community members in our forum. Stay well and stay brave.